Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the Map Talk webinar. My name is George Hammond. I'm Director of the Economic and Business Research Center here in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. I'll be your host for today's Map Talk, which is on COVID-19's impact on education. So a little bit about the webinar details. The Map Talk will be recorded and we'll be posting that recording tomorrow or on Friday, in any case, as soon as we can. The webinar will be conducted in conference mode, and that means that everyone will be muted except for the presenters. Now you can submit questions for the presenters at any time. The best way to do that is to use the Q&A function. You'll find that on your Zoom webinar controls. Just go ahead and type your question in for the panelists at any time. And at the end of the webinar, we've reserved about 20 minutes for Q&A, and I will put your questions to the panelists. You can also email me at ghammond@arizona.edu. Now, I want to thank our sponsors and partners of the MAP dashboard. Our partners are the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona, the PIMA Association of Governments, the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, Sun Corridor Incorporated, and of course, the University of Arizona. Our sustaining sponsors are Tucson Electric Power, the Thomas R. Brown Family Foundation, and the Freeport-McMoran Foundation. Without our partners and sponsors, the MAP dashboard would not be possible. I also want to remind you to check out the MAP dashboard features, which happen twice a month in the Arizona Daily Star. You can find us in the business section in the last Sunday of every month. You can also find us in the health section on the first Monday of each month. So be sure and subscribe to the Arizona Daily Star and check out the MAP features. So with that, I will turn the webinar over to our first presenter. And this is someone who is well known to all of you who know the MAP dashboard. It's Jennifer Pullen. Jennifer is a senior research economist in the Economic and Business Research Center, and she is also our excellent MAP dashboard coordinator. So Jennifer, please take it away.
Thank you, George. I'm going to screen share here. Let me screen share the MAP website and we'll get started once you can see that. Can you see that, George?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so today I'm going to discuss a recent article published on MAP that explores how the pandemic has impacted the education of Arizona school-aged children. I believe there are a lot of new attendees to our MAP talk today. So I thought before we dived into the education data, I would give you a quick overview of the MAP website and where to find the education related data and articles. So here across the top, you can find that we have 6 different categories that contain 6 different core indicators for each one. We have 36 core indicators that we explore on the MAP dashboard. If you click on that education icon, it will take you to an overview page. Here's where you'll find a snapshot, a scorecard of how the Tucson metropolitan area is doing relative to 11 other peer metropolitan communities. You can find that list right here of our 11 peer communities. And so how the scorecard works is we look at one of our indicators in educational attainment, for example, and this is telling us the percentage of those 25 years and older that have a bachelor's degree or better in the Tucson metropolitan area. It's 32.4%. That next column shows a partly sunny icon. That means that we rank in the middle third of our peer communities. And then that last column shows an up arrow, and that indicates that that percentage has increased over the last year of data that we compare the current year to. You can see there's a variety of icons. A sun icon means that we rank in the top third, partly sunny in the middle third, cloudy in the bottom third. And like you see here for teacher wages, this means we rank last relative to our 11 peer communities. This particular indicator, teacher wages, this looks at the median wage for a secondary school teacher or high school teacher in the Tucson metropolitan area in 2019. We just got this new data today. We got the 2020 data today. So we'll be updating that on the website tomorrow and on Friday. So if you come back and visit, we'll have that 2020 data for teacher wages available, as well as all occupational wages in our workforce and demographics category, kind of up by the end of the week. So this is a great place to go get an overview of how Tucson's doing in the education category. You can click on any of the individual indicators and get all of that detailed information that we provide for the 11 metropolitan areas that are comparable to Tucson, the 10 Western states, that benchmark data for the US, and then data for all 15 Arizona counties. And we disaggregate all of this data as much as possible so you can find it by race and ethnicity, by age, by family type, for each of our 36 core indicators. I'll go back to the MAP homepage here and briefly mention before we dive into the data that here is the slideshow. You can find all of the feature articles that we write. Today, we're going to be talking about one of those feature articles. We write 2 to 3 feature articles each month on the MAP dashboard in areas that are relevant to Southern Arizona. So you can find those here in the slideshow. Find the most recent here in that feature article block. This is that article we'll talk about today, distance learning and how COVID-19 has impacted Arizona students. If you scroll down a little bit, I just wanted to mention, for those that are new with us today, we have a monthly newsletter that we send out, and that keeps you up to date on upcoming MAP talks, on new data releases, new feature articles that we've written. So I sign up here and you'll get that monthly newsletter. We also post all of that stuff on Twitter. So if you prefer to follow us on Twitter, that's MapAZ dashboard on Twitter. Now let's go scroll back up, and the library section here, that link is above our mega menu. That is a great place to find all of the education related articles that we've published on the MAP dashboard. You can see everything over here is organized by category. So we have COVID related articles. We have all 6 of our categories listed here, as well as a few other select categories like our Southern Arizona communities, where you can find data for 43 different Southern Arizona cities, towns, and census designated places. And that includes information like educational attainment, poverty rate, and population growth for those different cities, towns, and census designated places. So, but we're here today to talk about distance learning and how COVID-19 impacts Arizona students. So I'm going to click directly on that article, and we'll go scroll down to the first visualization and talk a little bit about the data. So the data that we're going to talk about today comes from the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, and this data is all between mid-February to early March of this year, so 2021 data. The Census Bureau began collecting weekly data early on in the pandemic to provide the country with a look at how households are faring. The survey includes information on employment status, food security, housing, physical and mental health, access to healthcare, and educational disruptions. We've written several MAP articles on these topics. You can find them all in that library section of the MAP. Today, we're going to talk about what the recent education data tells us, and then Superintendent Baker is going to share the challenges that his school district has faced over the past year. So as a working parent with a child in elementary school, the challenges that these districts, school teachers, and parents have faced over the past year have been very near and dear to me. We know that nearly every school district in the country switched to online or distance learning almost overnight last March, and many of those schools continued with distance learning or a hybrid model at the beginning of the 2020-2021 school year. So in March of this year, as you can see from this visualization, 5% of households with school-age children in Arizona reported that there had been no impact in how their child received education during the pandemic. That means that 95% of households experienced an impact in the way their child received education in the last year. The rate varied widely across the Western states, with 17.5% of households in Idaho having no impact and less than 1% of households in Oregon having no impact. So that means that in Oregon, nearly every single household with school-age children had an impact on the way their child received education during the past year. The variation amongst the Western states is due to a variety of factors. It includes the percentage of children that were previously educated at home, either through homeschooling or an online education program. Also depended on state and local mandates. There was a lot of difference between the states and how they handled the closures of schools, closures of businesses over the last year. And then some of it was also dependent on local health conditions, and the positive COVID rates for each of the school districts, kind of determined whether schools were in person at times or in a hybrid learning model. So we know that nearly every child in the US and Arizona were distance learning at some point during the last year. So figure 2 in this article, we'll go down here, looks at, of those that were distance learning, what percentage were online and what percentage were using paper materials. So here, 76% of Arizona's children were doing their distance learning online, while 21.2% were using paper materials. The percentage of students that were online was slightly higher in Arizona when compared to the US, so about 68% here in the US to 76% in Arizona. So with most children that are distance learning doing so online, it's important to know how often these children were having contact with their teacher. So the survey asked that question, and we can look at here, this is frequency of live contact with teachers for children that are distance learning. And so in Arizona, 68% of students had live contact with their teacher 4 or more days a week. That was quite a bit higher than the national rate, which is just about 59%. The rate was even higher in Phoenix, which at almost 76%. Unfortunately, the household pulse survey data doesn't include information for the Tucson metropolitan area. We use Arizona and Phoenix kind of as a proxy of what's going on in Arizona. One concerning figure from this particular data is that more than 10% of children that were distance learning had 0 contact with a teacher. So that rate is at 12.3% for both the nation and Arizona, and slightly higher for Phoenix at almost 14%. So with most children learning online, the survey found that about 28% of those children were spending as much time on all of their learning activities as they were prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that means, and the survey also found that about 20% were spending more time. So in Arizona, about 11% were spending a little bit more time on their learning activities, and 9% were spending significantly more time. But that means that about half, or 45%, nearly half or 45% were spending less time on their learning activities than prior to the pandemic. Since kids are doing a lot of their learning activities online, that means reliable access to computer and internet are vital to the success of these students. So the household pulse survey also asked questions on computer access and internet access for households with children. So in Arizona, the percentage of households with a computer that was always available for education purposes here was 83%, just over 80% with school-age children in Arizona and in Phoenix had a computer always available. And a positive note here is that it was less than 2% of households never had a computer available for those children. As some of you might expect, there's significant variation in access to computer by income level. So we have that information here. And we found that in Arizona, the percentage of households with a computer always available dropped to 64% for those with an income of less than $25,000. The rate steadily increases as we would expect by income level. I want to take a moment here to mention that all of our graphs are clickable. If we were just interested in the US data, we could click off Arizona and Phoenix, and you can see how that rate steadily increases by income level for computer availability by household. Also, all of our visualizations we encourage you to use in your reports and presentations. You can download an image, a PNG, a JPEG, an SVG vector image for all of the visualizations you find on the map dashboard by clicking on these little 3 bars. And you can also download the data as a CSV or an Excel file. Important to keep in mind, if you want to download the data, if you want all of the data, make sure all of the geographies are clicked on, and then go in here and download by CSV or Excel file. So many school districts across the country have tried to provide computers to students that are, especially those students that are in need, but there has been wide variation across the districts. And I think that Dr. Baker will probably speak to this a little bit about the challenges his district faced, but we do see wide variation amongst the districts as well as the states. So in Arizona, about 53% of households reported that their school-age child had received a computer from their school for education purposes. And that rate was significantly higher in Washington state, with almost 77% of households reporting that their child had received a computer from their school district. So that's kind of what we know about computer access from the household pulse survey data for school-age children. But what about internet access? We know that internet access is equally important as access to a computer. So we've done a little work on the map dashboard previously that explored rural communities, and we know that rural communities, when compared to urban communities, struggle with reliable access to internet. So you can find that article in the library section of the map dashboard as well. But for this particular data shows us that that kind of holds true, because we see that in Arizona, 72.6% of households always had internet available for their child's education purposes. That was consistent with many of the other Western states here, California, Nevada, Oregon. But our more rural state of New Mexico had only 57.4% of households had internet access always available. So New Mexico is by far the more rural state here, followed by Texas. The data from the Household Pulse Survey also indicates that Hispanic or Latino households, both nationally and in Arizona, were less likely to have internet access always available. This was also the case for lower income households, as well as those in rural regions. So nationally, over 10% of households with school-aged children earning less than $25,000 had internet access provided by the school district. Many school districts tried to provide hotspots to households in need, just like they tried to provide computers. And so you see that that increase in internet access for those lower income groups from those receiving internet from their school or school district. So we'll scroll down here, and this is internet paid for by the child's school or school district. So across all groups, all households, we found that in Arizona, 5% had internet provided by the school district. Nationally, if you look at income, that lower income bracket, that was 10%. And then if you look at it by ethnicity, we find that the Hispanic or Latino households in Arizona, 12.3% had internet paid for by their child's school or school district, and that increased to 18.5% for Hispanic or Latino households in the Phoenix area. So I'm excited to turn things over to Dr. Baker in just a minute. I'm really interested in what he has to say, the challenges that his school district has faced. But I want to wrap up, and we know what we found is that nearly all households with school-aged children have been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. Most children are learning online, and that internet access has been vital to the success of that online learning. The data has also shown that distance learning has disproportionately impacted low-income and Hispanic or Latino households. And additionally, a recent article published by the Brookings Institute has shown that the pandemic has had disastrous consequences for working women. There's several reasons behind this. First, women are more likely to be in low-wage or face-to-face jobs, such as retail sales or leisure and hospitality. Both of those sectors have been hit especially hard by the pandemic. But the report also found that 1 out of 4 children who became unemployed during the pandemic reported that their job loss was due to a lack of childcare. And that was twice the rate reported by men. So the report shows that many working women have left the workforce to stay home with their children during distance learning. So the map will continue to track the educational impacts of the pandemic as new data becomes available. I encourage you to sign up for the newsletter to stay up to date. And I'll now turn the webinar back over to George, who will welcome Dr. Baker.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was great. Well, next up is our special guest, Dr. David Baker. Dr. Baker has been the superintendent of the Flowing Wells School District for the past 8 years. Prior to that, he worked as principal in both the Flowing Wells and Amphitheater school districts. Dr. Baker is a member of the Old Pueblo Rotary. He's on the board of Tucson Values Teachers, and he is part of the Pima County Cradle to Career Initiative. So David, we're very happy to have you here today. Thanks so much for coming, and please share your screen when you're ready, and the webinar is all yours.
Okay, thank you, George, and thank you, Jennifer. I hope to put some context around some of the comments that Jennifer was making. They were directly related to the experiences faced in my school district, the Flowing Wells School District here in Tucson, Arizona. But I would say that every district was faced with a similar set of challenges and circumstances surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. What I'd like to talk a little bit about is it actually began in March, as many of you are aware, March 15th, that Sunday afternoon, when we were notified that all schools would be closing for 2 weeks was the message at the time. And so the way I've kind of constructed this is to kind of think back to that point, March of 20 to today, March of 21. And there were some key decision points that sort of impacted our entire system, but largely around economic reasons, but then of course, educational models and how they were going to happen. We also began to develop a new language that we hadn't talked a lot about in our profession: hybrid, synchronous, asynchronous, remote. Those terms that we have all heard over and over through the years or through the months now, that we thought we had to actually construct what they meant. And so if I look back to March, we had in place in our district some experience with Google Classrooms, which is a platform by which content could be posted, distributed, and shared interactively with students wherever their location would be, remotely or at a different part of the building. But also we had many classrooms that had not been set up with Google Classrooms or not entered into a virtual environment at all. And so we were actually in a situation where we were doing paper packets of information. We would organize it on a Monday. We would invite our families to come in. We had very structured distribution at the time. We weren't sure how the virus was spread around surface contact and paper, how we were going to kind of handle materials. So we had to actually come up with an entire distribution system that was going to be weekly to parents, and we prepare that information for them, for their children, preschool all the way through 12th grade. That work would come back the following week. It would be assessed, graded by the teacher, and provided home. We didn't even have systems in place yet for communication beyond, email that was available in the district and telephones, but we had no virtual sort of interface that the Google Classroom ultimately would provide us. There are other software programs that can do it, and districts would just pursue one of these options. We were just barely beginning. As we closed out the year, we began to assess what was the fall going to look like. And so we get out in May. We are not a one-to-one district at this time. We have not embraced it, and we had to make a decision. At the time, also, all districts were really wrestling with an unstable funding source. We weren't sure what was going to happen with funding of students if they weren't present in a school for typical daily attendance hours. We weren't sure how we were going to pay for the following year budget, because we in Arizona work on a current year budget. So next year, depending on what enrollment looked like, would really impact our overall financial situation. And the federal dollars were just beginning to be discussed. And I'm going to refer to those as ESSER funds in this presentation. They do have some other terms, but ESSER funds is really the federal dollars that we were waiting for. Once we made the decision in June that we were going to become a one-to-one district, because we were concerned that schools would not open normally in August, we have begun a process of purchasing and developing 4,200 Chromebooks who were going to be provided to our 5,400 students. That was about $1 million decision. It was a significant decision in our organization. The governing board and I had to kind of discuss it quite a bit. And then we also had to kind of begin to explore how many families were going to need to have access to the internet. They didn't have it within their own home, at least in the stable environment that we were going to need in order to move to a one-on-one environment. So we worked with actually private donations. We did with some philanthropy groups to create an opportunity for 500 hotspots that we'd be able to send out into the home. And those became really useful because they could move wherever the child was. They could go with the computer, but they could also allow multiple people to jump onto that hotspot and engage in our virtual classrooms that we were preparing to build. Then we had several other expenditures that we did not normally have in our system. So we had to begin to really think about PP&E. We spent about $100,000 just preparing for things like, plexiglass and sanitizer, wipes and gloves and masks, and how we were going to kind of work hard at keeping our schools clean in this new environment. And then later in the summer, we have not been a one-to-one computer district. So we had to think about professional development, but we didn't have a lot of time. And so professional development is an expensive proposition because we really need to bring all of our teachers in over the summer and have them have access to training. And so we had new software programs that now we've heard of, Zoom or Flipgrid or Pear Deck, but those were not in our vocabulary. They were not in our training system. And we needed to support our staff as the real heavy lifting was going to become transforming our instructional model from where we had teachers in classrooms with kids to this virtual environment that was looking more and more like it was going to happen in August. Then we had to register our families. We had to find out what our families were going to be able to do. And so this is when this term of asynchronous or remote synchronous was going to happen. And so every district was faced with this challenge of how are we going to provide this content? And asynchronous in our decision was going to be a model by which families could interact with the curriculum at any time in the day around their schedule. So it'd be a flexible schedule that lessons would have to be either recorded by video or voice or posted in some sort of presentation software, but they could be accessed by the family at any time during the day around the family's schedule. or they were going to remote enroll in a remote, but we call it synchronous, which meant it was going to follow the regular bell schedule of the school. So at the elementary level, families would log in at 8 a.m. and join their classroom in the regular day. At the secondary level, we made a decision they would follow their regular bell schedule. So they would have a first hour class, a second hour class, et cetera, throughout the day. So that was going to become our remote model. And we had to find out where our families were. Notice that at this time, we're not offering an in-person model. We have made the decision that we're going to be remote only or virtual only at the beginning of the year. But we also began to think about staffing differently. As you begin to support almost 4,200 Chromebooks going out in the community, you're going to need additional staff. We had to have more technology support hired. We actually created an entire position that repairs broken screens and keyboards and turns devices around when they get broken. We had to create an inventory so families could bring those in if they were broken accidentally to continue their learning. We had to create teaching assistant positions that we didn't have before that could meet families, greet families at their sites because they couldn't get all to one district-wide location. We were going to need additional teachers to offer multiple formats for school, asynchronous and synchronous. We actually needed to increase staff. This is where sort of inefficiencies of our schools began to emerge and costs began to develop because we're going to have to offer things differently than we'd ever done before, and we needed more people. And then we were going to need more custodial staff. And that was, we were thinking in terms of some kids were going to be on campus. We had a requirement to have some kids on site that needed to be on site for a variety of reasons. And we're going to need custodial staff throughout the day as well as in the evening. And there was going to be additional cleaning and protocols instituted throughout the district. And so the word was mitigation strategies. And so we came up with an entire mitigation plan. All of that is moving. And then we have to start thinking about how is this impacting staff? And so staff addendums were eliminated. And that was things like we had to begin to say things that weren't going to happen. After school band programs or athletic programs were going to be impacted. Some of the extra things that we do in schools, like a yearbook at the elementary level, we were not going to be able to offer all of those things. We could tell that having everyone on campus in a traditional setting was just not going to be around. And so we began to make these decisions, and they were going to impact teachers financially. And so teachers needed, to know that as soon as it was possible that we could do it. But these were important decisions that were going forward. August is when we opened up school, and we did. We opened up all of our virtual models. We opened in both an asynchronous model and a remote model. We had about 350 kids join the asynchronous model all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade. We did have a virtual remote model even in our preschool system. And we began the school year. One of the things that began to materialize quickly is that our enrollment was dropping for a variety of reasons. We had families choosing to do homeschool. We had families looking for schools that were offering 5 days in person. And we had some families that were moving and relocating for a variety of reasons. So there's quite a bit of movement happening with families. And that impact was we were targeting already in August of about $1.5 million loss in funding for our school district. And the reason that is because we are currently thinking of current year funding, meaning we're funding for the students that were enrolled in the district. This scenario of student movement and mobility and kind of families addressing the needs within their own homes relative to the pandemic is happening across the whole state of Arizona. Every district is impacted by this. And so we saw this turn happening. And the questions around it were, how were we going to manage that on a financial kind of basis as well as an educational basis? October is the first month when we begin to bring students back in. And this is that word hybrid that's become really common in our vocabulary now, but this is, every district came up with some sort of model. And our model was at the elementary level, all kids would come in for a half day of instruction and receive reading and mathematics instruction live from their classroom teacher. And then we would have those kids go home and do their specials, their science, their social studies activities in a virtual or remote model. And the other half of the kids would come in the afternoon and receive direct instruction for their math and their reading. That meant that we had to turn we had a transportation system that actually brought all the kids in and out of the school twice instead of one time. We had to think about lunch and distribution of food differently than we've done before. Sack lunches, very quick turnaround. We had to think about cleaning our schools differently because we had an in-school cleaning. That was our elementary model. At the secondary level, we did one day a week. The way we started, kids would come back on campus that chose to come back. And then we were able to do things like social distancing with 6 feet separation. And then we offered the full remote model and its asynchronous model going at the same time. Some of the challenges there is we needed our families to make the decisions, and about 50% of our families stayed remote, and about 50% of our families began to come back in a hybrid model. And we could tell real quickly that this is going to be, I think, where our district was going to land with many of our decisions about 50-50. There was no clear-cut direction of our community or a district in order to try to streamline the number of instructional models that we were going to utilize. The next decision point comes as state aid. When students are in a remote model, and remember, we're thinking now 50% of our students will be in a remote model, and they have been for a while and probably will be for the rest of the year. That is another loss of revenue because you don't get full ADM or daily membership funding for those children in Arizona. You get 95% of the funding. But the governor is working behind in creating an enrollment stabilization grant to bring that number from 95% up to 98%, or potentially all the way up to 100%. So there is some work being happened at the legislative level and out of the governor's office to offset those dollars, because there was a recognition that there needed to be a hybrid or a remote model in place for many different schools across the state of Arizona. So we do now see that funding is becoming less unstable, but we see the governor, we see the ESSER funds coming in to kind of help support districts in this transition period as we're trying to figure out how we're going to deliver services. And then we ran that model of hybrid until the winter break. And then cases began to kind of increase significantly over the winter break. And the decision was that we were going to remove ourselves from the hybrid model, go back to asynchronous model and remote models only in January. We stayed in that model for January. In February, as the case counts began to drop significantly again, we opened back up our hybrid model. Each one of these decision points is, as you can imagine, a significant communication challenge, as well as some anxieties and concerns and trying to move the models back and forth. But we did come back in a hybrid model in February. And then now in March, we have added, instead of having a hybrid model, we have a traditional elementary model 5 days a week, starting at 8 o'clock in the morning and going till roughly a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon every day of the week. At the secondary levels, meaning 7 through 12, we have 4 days a week, all day long kids that are on campus. We are still offering our asynchronous model. Remember, that is for our students that are accessing the curriculum based upon the needs of the family, anytime, any place. And then we have our remote model, which is our direct instruction model with teachers where kids are accessing the curriculum with direct lessons. We're doing it through video cameras and microphone systems. And so that is all continuing, and that's where we are today. And we are still at the elementary level, about 70% of our families have chosen to come into the traditional model and 30% are staying remote or asynchronous. The secondary level, our junior high, about 60% of our families have chosen to come into this school 4 days a week. And at the high school, it's about 50% of our families have chosen to come in on the 4-day model. So we still have a significant number of families accessing our system in education through remote models and asynchronous and synchronous as well. And so all of that continues today. And so we'll continue to go forward. One of the things that we're trying to get assessment of is sort of where are some impacts on learning. And I'll share just a couple of slides. Oh, I went one too far, George. There it is. So instead of focusing so much on the numbers here, I think the picture representations sort of tell the story of what we're seeing emerge. And there is a gap between performance of last year, meaning 19 and 20 as compared to this year, 20 and 21. And then you'll hear about it in the media, and we're talking about it in educational systems. And every district is trying to kind of get a sense of what has happened with the number of kids that have been learning remotely on campus and some differences. But you can see in kindergarten last year, there's growth throughout the year. So 32% of our students demonstrating proficiency at this point in time, and it grows to 51% on the second. This year, we actually see a decline. We see kids having a little bit of higher level proficiency at the beginning of the year, and they've dropped down in their proficiency at 27%. First grade, you can see that we started off quite a bit lower on this particular assessment, and the gains have happened throughout the year, but not to the extent that we saw last year. And you can see that is representing again in second grade, and in third grade, you see an increased drop. And these, I use these for comparison data because it is easier sort of to look at assessment on a year-to-year comparison instead of trying to make a determination of, is our performance where it should be relative to the measure that you're using, compared to the state group or something like that. But looking internally, we can see that there are some gaps that have developed and that we're going to try to close. In mathematics, we see the same sort of pattern here. I just picked some different grades for our conversation today, but you can see in 8th grade mathematics, by this time with our third assessment internally, we'd have about 47% proficiency as compared to 34% proficiency. Looking at high school algebra, this isn't the honors program. This is a traditional algebra 9th grade course that many of our students engage in. You can see that mathematics has a gap that's larger than we would hope, and obviously that has increased over the year. And then you can see geometry is showing actually a little closer pattern as we've gone through the year. And then if I just sort of take the 3 averages of the scores to kind of get a sense of where we might be academically, you can see that we do see some gaps as compared to the performance the previous year. The challenge, of course, for all of our school districts is there's no one reason why anything is happening. We do know that lack of access to school has changed the environment. For schools. And so these are some of the things that happen that we typically would have in our school system, where we bring kind of students together and build culture and collaboration and supportive systems that have been disrupted significantly this year. You sort of take a look. I would imagine if you have school-age children, you've seen this. We've lost things like after-school programming and daily field trips or volunteers. We've also lost things like recognition assemblies, overnight field trips where we really explore, science in our community. For example, when we do trips to the oceans or California, athletic traditional ceremonies like graduation, prom, college recruitment fairs, all of these things have been impacted by COVID, and they all have an interrelationship of how schools work, and different pieces impact academically, but they also build peer groups and conversations and a focus on kind of what we're trying to do within a school system. And so every district has been wrestling with each one of these. And as we look forward, we have quite a bit of work ahead of us to partner with our families and our students to really kind of catch up in some ways, but also to recreate systems of sort of comfort around school, and also to learn and take from us what we have within our virtual worlds and go forward and build upon those as well. And so the challenges are stark and striking. And I know our teachers are working incredibly hard, and we're very fortunate to have them engaged in this entire process, because that is really where the work is happening. In my role, trying to support that the continuation of instructional, support in our classrooms. And so I'd like to sort of, stop my share here and be available for kind of questions and conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. That was fantastic. So we do have a couple of questions. The first one I think is for Jennifer. So Jennifer, there's a lot of data on the K through 12 students. Is there any information available about what's going on with adult students?
Yeah, there is a little bit of data from the Household Pulse Survey about adult education and what the impact has been there. And we plan to follow up with some additional articles on the MAP dashboard with the continued impact of both K-12 and then higher education as well. So stay tuned for those. We'll post them in the newsletter and on Twitter when they're available.
Okay, great, thanks. The next one is for David. So are schools able to offset the costs and losses that you've experienced through funding that you're receiving through the CARES Act and the subsequent fiscal support from the federal government?
Yes. So this is going to be a story that's going to be, I think, actually really important to tell. The governor's enrollment stabilization grant will be very helpful. That was that remote learning of 95% funding, and it will affect all districts across the state of Arizona equally. The CARES Act, or the ESSER funds from the federal government, and there's 3 of them now, are delivered through the Title I system, meaning it's based upon poverty counts in districts. And so as those dollars come into the districts in flowing wells, those dollars will be able to offset the impact. But districts that don't receive Title I funding had similar costs associated with the pandemic. So they had supply costs around PPE that they didn't have before, and increased custodial costs. And they are not going to receive those dollars in the near the size or the scope that a district like Flowing Wells will receive, or other districts here locally. And so there will be a disproportionate effect on managing those costs. But in my district, those dollars will be able to offset those costs and be incredibly helpful and allow us actually to maintain our one-to-one environment going forward.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question for you, David. So you've identified some learning gaps and talked about those. Could you talk a little bit about the strategies that you'll use to address those learning gaps going forward?
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at, obviously in-classroom strategies will be in place, but we're going to look for additional learning opportunities in our summer school programs, but also after-school programs throughout the year next year. There's, it's really difficult, and everything we're kind of looking at is you can't make one intervention to make these, to help support across the board. So what you want to do is provide a continuum of opportunities. So summer school will probably be targeted for academic interventions, but we're thinking next year after school, we also need to have enrichment opportunities for kids where they're just engaging with other kids. They're talking about class and learning. They're engaging in science experiments and building and constructing, lessons that or activities that we would normally do. And we're going to try to just give them exposure to contextualized learning as well. And so there's not going to be like a 2-week window when we are able to kind of close this gap. We're looking at it as a continuum of probably, 12 to 18 months.
Great. This is maybe a little bit for both of you. So is there any data available on the impact for preschool and pre-K children? And in general, what do you think the impact of the pandemic on those children will be when they enter kindergarten? David,
Well, so for the MAP dashboard, we track the student achievement data, and we'll certainly look at that. Unfortunately, that data, it takes a little bit of time to get compiled and released, so we won't have it for a while. But I think what we'll do on the MAP dashboard is not just look at the scores, but we'll look at the scores for the incoming cohort relative to the previous cohort, so we can see if there's a big difference between those entering kindergarten this coming school year relative to those in the previous kindergarten cohort. So we'll have that on the MAP dashboard as soon as it's available. We look at both the NAEP scores and the MAP scores on the dashboard, and find that in education.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. David?
Yeah, in our system, our preschool did stay open. We did have a remote option available for families that chose that instead of coming to school, but our preschool did stay open throughout the pandemic. And so, I'm sorry, since August, not last March, but since August. And so we think that those families will have a similar experience. However, there were less kids enrolled. And so one of the things that we'll be looking at is the number of kindergartners coming in that did not have access to a preschool, that historically did have access to a preschool. We might see some differences there.
Okay, great. Next question is, do you have any specific policy recommendations at the local or the state level that can help close the performance gaps that have developed?
So we have, I think we're going to need a little bit of time, to be honest, to figure out where our kids are after the next, if school and the virus and the pandemic stays where it is now, we're able to keep school open the remainder of the year, which I'm optimistic will happen. Then we'll have a better sense of where our students are. I do think that the ESSER funds for our district are going to provide us the practice and the opportunity to extend learning, not only for this summer, but for summers in the future. And that if we can engage our families and have students access those programs, that I think will be really successful. And I think most districts are going to be in that place. And so we're going to need, we're just going to have to, I think we're just going to have flexibility in the funding sources the best that we can to address things like summer lunch programs and transportation, extending those opportunities, and then have some flexibility that the policy doesn't direct the money to be so specific that it's a measurable mathematical or reading assessment gain that we're tracking, but actually we're looking at the holistic approach to education. And that's where I think we get into ideas of enrichment. And so as long as the funding sources aren't so strictly tethered to an academic measure that you have to do in the short run, but can be more holistic to look at, recreating field trips for kids in the summer, recreating opportunities to connect it to real world experiences. I mean, that takes time. And so I think the policy implication would be, as I'm sort of thinking this through, is that we don't want funds so restrictive that we can't elongate the opportunities for learning, and have some flexibility in how it's delivered without like a measurable, something we're trying to measure within 2 weeks.
Right. Good. So there were enrollment declines, and for high school students, I think there's some uncertainty about what those students decided to do. Some of them may have gone into the workforce. Do you have a feel for how much of that actually happened?
Only anecdotally. We know it's happened. We have had stories from students that have contacted our high school administration that have said they're going to stay asynchronous because they're working now to help their families. I don't have a number, but I do know that we have a number of students that have said they'd really like to stay remote. So think of only 50% of our kids have come back to our model. And the question for next fall is, do we provide a remote model for our students? And what would be the educational impact for those students if they stayed in a remote model longer? We don't have the data here to answer that question. And so we're going to have to trust our parents and students and probably offer that opportunity and let them make the choice. And then as we get more information, be able to share it back out. But we just don't know the long-term impact.
Yeah, that's good. Kind of a similar question for you, David. What are the biggest lessons that you learned from adapting to the pandemic, and how do you think those will translate into how the district operates going forward?
Well, one of the lessons that we learned is that families need to have enjoyed or embraced the opportunity to connect with our schools via Zoom or a virtual platform. It provides them flexibility with childcare, it provides them flexibility with working around schedules. And so something like a parent could the principal could call a meeting in the middle of the day and do it by Zoom. And a large number of families could actually access that because they're not having to deal with travel and transportation, and they could participate in a conversation. So for example, at our high school right now is how do we manage graduation, which is really important to seniors and seniors' families. We can engage our families differently now than we ever were able to before. I think we've also learned that there's some limitations on survey information. You have to be really good at writing survey questions to get answers that you want. And so although it's important to do survey information, we're finding that having 50 parents show up into a Zoom setting is actually, we get quite a bit of really specific and granular information that we can act upon. And I also think that teachers have appreciated the opportunity to do things like parent conferences differently with remote, and that there's some opportunities there to really help families interact with the school that we hadn't had before. And then, of course, we're looking at how do you curate content and make it available for kids when they're absent. And we're seeing that. And so there's some opportunities there for us as well.
Oh, wow, that's really fascinating. So Jennifer, a question for you. There's a lot of really cool information that you presented, and that's in the article. But it's kind of a point in time. Will you be able to track the trends in how that evolves going forward?
Yeah, we'll definitely be able to track the household pulse survey data. The article that we just published was just a point in time, kind of the most recent data that was available, but we can look at how those trends have changed over time. And as long as I know the household pulse survey is planning to continue for the next several months. So we'll be able to track that through at least the end of this school year, I believe. But then in the future, we'll be able to track additional changes in things like the student achievements and the percentage of, we'll be able to look at, what percentage of students are entering the workforce as seniors into college versus, going to college and then, or continuing how many, I know anecdotally, I have family members that took a gap year this year. They graduated high school last year, they took a gap year they'll start college next year in a more traditional setting. So we'll be able to track that kind of data too, and look at, was there a significant decline in college enrollment this year? And did the next year then get a good bump up? So we'll continue to track all of this kind of information that we have. And we're always interested, from the public, especially the educators that know about data that we might not have in the MAP dashboard that you feel is relevant to our community. Please share that data with us, and we can see, if we can write something, if it's something we can put on the MAP dashboard.
Okay, great. I think we're at we've reached the end of our questions. Are there any last comments from David or Jennifer?
I would just like to share that one of the things the pandemic did reinforce for me was the incredible creativity and ingenuity of teachers, and what they were able to produce and create and support families, and the incredible support that families also afforded our school system. They knew that this was a challenging situation for them personally, but also for their children. And people really came together in the best interest of working for kids, and all those creative energies really have produced some really quality products, meaning classroom assignments and lessons and activities. And I feel very fortunate to have worked during this time with really amazing people.
Great, fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. I have been in awe of the teachers my child has had over the last 2 years, and what they've done for him in their classroom and the schools and the children. And it's been really, it's been a trying time, but it's been interesting to watch this transition and see how gracefully teachers and school staff have interacted with children and just changed, and they're up for the challenge, and it's great.
Oh, great. Well, thanks so much. And thanks so much to our two speakers for all the wonderful information that you shared. It's really cool to hear. And I think this has been a great session. Maybe we can do it again in the fall. So thanks to all of you for attending today's MAP Talk webinar. Be sure to visit the MAP Dashboard website often. There's always new information there, and sign up for the newsletter so you know when the next MAP Talk is going to be. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending. Thanks to our speakers again, and have a safe and a fun afternoon and evening. Goodbye.